My name's Ingrid Cumming, and I'm here on behalf of the custodians and traditional owners of Whadjuk Noongar country and the families that are Burnell, Shaw and Collard. It's my utmost pleasure to come here and provide a welcome to country for you people today. The history behind welcome to country, traditionally when new people would come into country, we would greet them and pass on things like Budawankings or message sticks, and we would basically give them information about how to travel through country so they were safe and felt welcomed. And I certainly hope that this welcome resonates those same feelings today. I'm going to sing to you in language. Don't fear, I understand not everyone's a Noongar linguist in the room, that's more than fine. But basically what I'm singing about is bringing on good spirit into country to look over all you people as you walk through. Before I do start, most importantly, I'd like to honour my elders past and present, because without them I wouldn't be able to stand here and carry on these 1,000-year-old traditions. Feel free to clap along and get yourselves warmed up for the afternoon. Kaya kwapira wirin, kaya kwapira wirin, nyaku kwapira wirin. Dinading iranuna, maman yoga kalinga, maman yoga kalinga. Dinading iranuna, nityan yung abuja, kwapira yung abuja. Maya ngang butang, maya ngang beria, maya ngang kulinga. Wanju nityan yung abuja. Thank you. The final part of the Welcome to Country is passing on the Budawanking. However, reading the brief about Ms Cordelia Fine, I find that this particular gift is probably way more appropriate. What I have here is what we call a women's belt. It's made from reeds here from the Swan River. This belt has been used in many different women's ceremonies, including a burial ceremony of a very significant female elder. And it's true, when we think about anthropologists that first came here and studied about our people, the Noongar people, they took on the stories of the men, their culture, their dances, but very seldom took on the information of the women. And in Noongar culture and a lot of Indigenous Australian cultures here, we believe that it's not matriarchal or patriarchal, that we're equal. So the women's place and women's law and women's culture is just as important. It needs to be recognised. So this is a very powerful piece of Noongar history, and like I said, uses for many ceremonies. It's very powerful, and I'm very honoured to pass this on to you, Cordelia, if you'd like to accept this on behalf of the Noongar community. Thank you very much for inviting me here today. I look forward to hearing what Ms Fine has to say, and as our people say here in Noongar country, Jening Buddha Jening. We will see you again soon. Thank you.
There are many distinguished people here today, and I'd particularly like to acknowledge the Honourable Robin McSweeney, MLC, Minister for Child Protection, Community Services, Seniors and Volunteering and Women's Interests, and Associate Professor Cordelia Fine, our wonderful guest speaker today. To Professor Robin Quinn, our Deputy Vice-Chancellor, Education at Curtin University, to my colleague Professor Magella Fransman, Pro-Vice-Chancellor of the Faculty of Humanities at Curtin University, to Dr Linley Lord, who was the 2010 Clare Burton guest speaker, to Ms Jenny Perkins, who's the Director-General of the Department of Communities, and to all our distinguished guests, and especially to my colleagues. What a wonderful day to be together and to think about the sorts of issues about gender equity. So have a wonderful luncheon. I particularly welcome also the 2010 Clare Burton Scholarship recipient, Melissa Marinelli, who's from Curtin. So we acknowledge Melissa's win and delighted to have you here with us. Thank you. I welcome you all then to the 13th annual event to celebrate and commemorate the life of Dr Clare Burton. And it's wonderful to see so many repeat visitors here today, both from universities, from government and from the private sector. And I know that there are many of you who have been here to a great many of those 13 lectures. The Clare Burton Annual Memorial Lecture was initiated by the ATN WEXDev, which is the Women's Executive Development Program established by the 5 universities of the Australian Technology Network, or the ATN. Those universities include Queensland University of Technology, University of Technology Sydney, RMIT University in Victoria, University of South Australia and Curtin University. And the ATN WexDev program is a strategic career development program designed for senior women, both academic and general staff, within the ATN universities. And the program is in response to the continued underrepresentation of women at senior levels in higher education. And of course, it's a situation that Australia shares with the international university community and indeed the broader community. At Curtin, we've made great progress in recent years and women are well represented in senior management of the university, but we've still got quite some distance to go to achieve equal representation at lower levels of management and at senior academic and professional staff classifications, which we are hoping to progress through our Advancing Women's strategy. And I would just make the comment, while you think you're doing okay, it only can take a month or a few months and you seem to be almost back where you started. So it's a fragile project keeping gender equity balanced, and it needs to be ongoingly supported. Clare Burton passed away in August 1998 and was someone who made a difference during her lifetime. In Australia during the 1980s and 1990s, Clare was the intellectual force behind employment equity programs. It was her academic research on gender and race bias, as well as her work as a public sector administrator, which became the basis for policy both in the public and private sectors. She was known as the guru of equity practitioners, and some of you here today may have known Clare and her work and indeed been involved in policy work yourself with her. These lectures support the awarding of the Clare Burton Scholarship, which was established by Clare's family and the 5 ATN universities to honour and continue the work of Dr. Clare Burton into gender equity. The $10,000 scholarship is open to postgraduate students within the ATN universities for a research-based gender equity project. And to date, the proceeds from the Perth event have contributed more than $16,000 towards those scholarships. And the scholarship will be again available for 2012. The applications close very shortly on the 18th of November, and there are details on your table, so I encourage you to look to the opportunities for identifying postgraduate research study students. We're honoured to have with us today the Minister for Women's Interests, the Honourable Robin McSweeney, who will a little later introduce our guest speaker. Robin is a wife and a mother of 4 adult children and is best known for her role in leading and setting long-term goals as both Minister and Shadow Minister in the social portfolios of child protection, seniors and volunteering, local government, women interests and emergency services. She was elected as a member of the Legislative Council for the South West region in 2001. Robin's current role as Minister for Child Protection, Community Service, Seniors and Volunteering, Women's Interests and Youth is the result of many years of representation at both the local and state level. Our guest speaker today, Dr. Cordelia Fine, is an academic psychologist and author, and she's been described variously as, quote, that rare academic who's also an excellent writer, a cognitive neuroscientist with a sharp sense of humour and an intelligent sense of reality, and finally, and that was from the Times, and finally from the Times Higher Education Supplement, a brilliant feminist critic of the neurosciences. In her lecture today, entitled How the New Neurosexism Helps Sustain the Status Quo, Dr. Fine will show how stereotypes created in the name of science have influenced attitudes and behaviour in the workplace in self-fulfilling ways and how they still interfere with our trajectory towards real equality. Today's lecture is certainly an intriguing topic and an examination of yet another subtle barrier to women's rightful equality. Cordelia commenced this lecture series in Melbourne on the 26th of October, and today is her final and 5th lecture, so quite an achievement. We'd like to congratulate you, Cordelia, on what we believe has been an extraordinarily successful lecture series, and we're looking forward to hearing your lecture. Finally, on behalf of the Australian Technology Network, WexDev and Curtin University, I thank our sponsor, the Department of Communities, for their continued support and involvement in these lectures. So we greatly appreciate the ongoing support.
Good afternoon, everyone, and a warm welcome to all of you. It is a pleasure to be here today to introduce and welcome our guest speaker. The State Government, through my Department for Communities, is very proud to partner with Curtin University in this very important lecture series. I'm very pleased that we are able to contribute to the debate on gender equity and to drive it forward with new information and ideas. The proceeds of this event will contribute to the Clare Burton Memorial Scholarship Fund, which does support postgraduate research into gender equity. Dr. Clare Burton was a leader in driving forward that gender equity debate. Her work in the 1980s and 90s put equal pay on the industrial relations agenda, and her book, Redefining Merit, became the Equal Opportunities Practitioner's Bible. Given Clare's legacy as a leading researcher, academic, consultant, author on gender equity, it is fitting that we're about to hear from another woman who is also a leader in her field. Today we welcome Dr. Cordelia Fine to the stage. Dr. Fine has also undertaken to understand how and why gender inequality exists, and I'm sure I could tell her a few things myself. Dr. Fine is a psychologist and neuroscientist whose writing has drawn accolades from reviewers and her academic peers around the globe. She's travelled the world presenting her findings at research conferences, and her popular books on neuroscience have been printed and reprinted across the world. What makes Dr. Fine's work distinctive is the level of clarity and humour she brings to a very complex subject. She is an expert translator and is able to make the maths of neuroscience studies and reports understandable for us all, even me. In her latest book, Delusions of Gender, Dr. Fine sets out to challenge and disprove many of the scientific arguments for gender as hardwired quality. We would not have a better guide for a subject that is long overdue for discussion. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Fine to the stage to deliver her lecture entitled How the New Neurosexism Helps Sustain the Status Quo. Thank you.
Thank you very much for these wonderful introductions, especially the beautiful one from Ingrid, and for the wonderful gift, which I will treasure. Thank you for that. And thank you all for coming this afternoon. It's a great honour to be here. I'd like to thank the hosts for this event and also express my thanks to Anna Reeder, who organised me extremely efficiently over the course of the 2-week lecture series. Everything that I've read and heard about Clare Burton makes it clear that she was a woman who cared deeply and passionately about both social justice and rigorous scholarship, and whose intellectual legacy includes not just her own work, but that of everyone whose thinking and commitments her work continues to influence and inspire. In her eulogy for Clare Burton, Quentin Bryce described marvelling at, to quote, the thoroughness of the research, the analysis of her data, the power of her argument, the strength of her reasoning, the persuasion of her language, the breadth of her references, the detail of her bibliography, the courage of her conviction, her passion and her faith. So it is a very great honour to be giving the Clare Burton Memorial Lecture 2011, not least because the virtues she exemplified are those that are inspirational to everyone whose work touches on the question of sex equality. And on this, I can offer myself as a personal example. The topic of the role of sexist science in perpetuating sex inequality is one that I stumbled into quite accidentally only a few years ago. Originally, my one and only target in my book, Delusions of Gender, were the popularisers who exaggerate, misrepresent, and sometimes even fabricate facts about sex differences in the brain and what they supposedly mean for how and why males and females think, feel, and behave differently. But the pleasant veil of ignorance soon fell, and I came to realise that neurological explanations and justifications for the status quo are as old as brain science itself and are continuously renewed. No sooner has one hypothesis, long past its best-by date, finally been hurled onto the scrap heap of sexist science than another one is there to take its place. As the sociologist Hilary Rose points out, for feminists, this means that every generation has to take up a fight that is both new and old. And it is, I discovered, rather alarming to find yourself taking up such a fight when you have only just realised that you are standing in the middle of a battleground. And it is impossible for me to overstate the contribution of the work of feminist scholars the heroes in my own field, such as Anne Fausto-Sterling, Ruth Blyer, and Australia's own Leslie Rogers, in enabling a fresh battalion of researchers to tackle this latest fight in the longest war. The intellectual power and rigour of their arguments, mercilessly exposing the holes in claims that, ironically, female brains are better suited to sympathy than science, were so prescient that they remain relevant decades later. But even more than this, these researchers have shown incredible dedication to the tedious and frustrating task of cleaning up the sludge of sloppy, sexist neurobiology. These qualities of rigour and dedication are of extraordinary value to anyone unfortunate enough to be dissatisfied with the status quo, to be sometimes angry, sometimes despairing, but above all, willing to take up the feminist chisel that is passed on through the generations and do their bit to chip away at the complex, interacting and multi-level factors that stand in the way of a better and fairer society. The task is enormous, but progress comes. And it is people like Clare Burton to whom we owe the greatest gratitude. Her work, to quote Bryce again, has meant that doors have been opened wide and paths made smoother for all of us. We find in her life's work a source of courage, support, and inspiration. I didn't know Clare Burton, but I certainly know what precious gifts, both personal and intellectual, these are for feminists, and that is why I'm truly honoured to be part of this tradition, to celebrate her work, and to be delivering this year's Clare Burton Memorial Lecture. Excuse me. Just before I get on to the new neurosexism, a brief spiel about the old neurosexism. In 1915, in the opinion pages of the New York Times, the noted neurologist Dr. Charles Dana offered his professional insights into the controversial topic of votes for women. Dr. Dana expressed the following concern. If women achieve the feministic ideal and live as men do, they would incur the risk of 25% more insanity than they have now. So where exactly in the female nervous system did the problem lie? Well, Dr. Dana pointed out that the upper half of the spinal cord that controls the pelvis and limbs is larger in women. The implications for women's suffrage? To Dr. Dana, and I think the key to understanding his chain of reasoning here may lie in the word pelvis, this suggests that, to quote, women's efficiency lies in a special field and not that of political initiative. It seems laughable now, but a contemporary, influential and widely disseminated scientific hypothesis tells much the same story in different words, that males are designed to advance civilization, females to nurture it. According to this account, sex differences in prenatal hormone levels, in particular testosterone, have permanent effects on the brain that hardwire or predispose male brains on average to understand the world and female brains to understand people. In this lecture, I'm going to chart the journey of the new neurosexism as it makes its way from scanner to soundbite to society. And society is where the journey not just ends, but begins, a society in which men and women still tend to be segregated, not just horizontally in terms of pink and blue occupations and roles, but also vertically, with decreasing numbers of women the higher up any ladder you go. Why is this still the case in our apparently egalitarian 21st century society? Is a status quo in which politics, wealth, business, art, science and technology lie predominantly in the hands of men to be blamed entirely on sexism and socialisation? Or is sex inequality to some extent natural, inevitable and immutable, set in the womb and fixed in our brains? Your implicit assumptions about the answer to this question, or the answer you choose to assume until it's proven wrong, has political implications. And if you are a neuroscientist working in the area of sex differences, these assumptions and political values creep into research. Now, I realise that to particular sections of the academic community, when I make this kind of statement, they tend to politely look at their watches and stifle yawns, but to me, coming from a background in cognitive neuroscience, this was a horrible shock to realise that science wasn't quite as objective as I'd assumed, and frankly, I'm still recovering from this awful insight. Neuroscientists have three important obstacles to deal with when it comes to sex differences in the brain. The first is the problem of spurious or chance results. The second is the problem of understanding what, if anything, a sex difference in the brain actually means for thinking, feeling, or behaviour. And the third is the changeable nature of both brains and minds. And how neuroscientists tackle these three issues reveals a great deal about implicit beliefs and values around sex differences. So the first issue is spurious results. In behavioural science, researchers generally declare a difference between two groups as statistically significant if there's a 1 in 20 probability or less that it's just due to chance. Now, while false positive or spurious results are a danger in any area of research, it's long been appreciated that this is an especially important problem for research into sex differences. And this is because, as neuroendocrinologist Melissa Hines neatly summarised it, sex is, to quote, easily assessed, routinely evaluated, and not always reported. Because it is more interesting to find a difference than to find no difference, the 19 failures to observe a difference between men and women go unreported, whereas the 1 in 20 finding of a difference is likely to be published. The possibility of spurious results in sex differences is certainly not something that functional neuroimagers should ignore. Although the images produced by this technology look like objective pictures of neural activity that are busy here or quiet there, these blobs of colour actually represent patterns of statistical significance, the endpoint of extremely complex and not entirely agreed upon methods of data processing and statistical analysis. As cognitive neuroscientist Jeffrey Aguirre has put it, these pretty pictures hide the sausage factory. So there's plenty of scope for spurious results. Take, for example, a functional neuroimaging study published in the prestigious journal Nature in 1995 by a team from Yale University. The researchers scanned 19 men and 19 women while they performed 3 different language tasks. For 2 of the 3 tasks, there were no sex differences in brain activity. But for the third task, phonological processing, or what words sound like, brain activity in the language areas tended to be greater on the left side than the right side in men, but distributed more equally in women. Now, these findings spoke to a long-standing but very controversial claim that the male brain is more lateralised for language and other tasks than the female brain. That is, that males tend to process information within one hemisphere to be more compartmentalised, whereas the female brain tends to recruit both sides of the brain to be more interconnected. But in what way does the study speak to this hypothesis, for or against? Because you recall that in 2 out of the 3 tasks, the male-female activity was indistinguishable. And so, as neuroscientist Anneliese Kayser and colleagues have pointed out, the choice of the authors to emphasise the single finding of difference over the 2 findings of similarity in their article title and the article itself was neither scientifically inevitable nor politically neutral. Sorry, this doesn't make me cry, I'm just about to cough. I cry about it in private. Now, this study has had massive impact and has been cited over 600 times in the scientific literature. But was this one finding of difference even real and reliable? In 2004 and then again in 2008, the neuropsychiatrist Iris Sommer and her colleagues performed what's called a meta-analysis, in which all the available neuroimaging studies with information about sex differences in language lateralisation, so this is whether it was reported or just as information that researchers had that they hadn't published, were pulled together, yielding a sample size in the 2008 meta-analysis of more than 2,000 participants. And their conclusion, in both 2004 and 2008, was that there are no sex differences in language lateralisation. Excuse me. A closely related claim is that the corpus callosum, which is a thick band of neurons that connect the 2 hemispheres of the brain, is larger in females. And supposedly this oversized corpus callosum helps along the more interconnected collaborative style of the female brain. But again, a large meta-analytic study published in 1997 found no support for this idea. Excuse me. And yet this idea of a compartmentalised male brain and an interconnected female brain persists. In fact, I was recently speaking at a conference for marketing researchers, and the gentleman speaking before me stood up and very confidently proclaimed that the corpus callosum was 300% larger in women, and that's why they talk to so much or something. Well, I sat there with my arms folded, looking very, very, very cross, I'm sure. So in an article published earlier this year exposing the pseudoscience behind the promotion of single-sex education, the neuroscientist Lise Elliott complained that popular writers, by failing to keep up with the empirical situation and cherry-picking positive findings like the Yale study, are perpetuating neuromyths. So here, for example, are these very claims in a 2005 opinion piece, again in the New York Times. The author wrote, "In women, the connective tissue that allows communication between the two hemispheres of the brain tends to be thicker, perhaps facilitating interchange. This may explain why one study from Yale found that when performing language tasks, women are likely to activate both hemispheres, whereas males, on average, activate only the left hemisphere." Now, this information about the supposedly different brains of men and women was offered in the context of an article defending the suggestion made by Lawrence Summers, while president of Harvard University, that women might be, on average, intrinsically less capable of very high-level mathematical and scientific thinking. But the author was not a popular writer, but a distinguished professor of psychology at Cambridge University, and he's certainly not alone in perpetuating neuromyths. In 2009 and 2010, 5 to 6 years after Sommer and colleagues' first meta-analysis, the Yale study was cited more than 50 times. When I looked at how the Yale study was cited in each article, I found that only 19% of citing authors referred to one or other meta-analysis accurately, and in a way that indicated that the large meta-analytic study might trump the small Yale one. Worse, just over half of all citing articles cited the Yale study without mentioning the existence of any contradictory data whatsoever. I share Elliott's frustration and fully endorse her criticism of popular writers, but clearly the scientific community needs to lead by example. A second important lesson from the Yale study is you would think for neuroscientists to try to avoid offering up too many cherries for popular writers to pick in the first place in the terms of false positive results. Yet again and again, when I was reading popular books about gender, following up their claims would take me to functional neuroimaging studies with extremely modest sample sizes. But were these just isolated cases? I recently looked at the sample sizes of all functional neuroimaging studies published in 2009 and 2010 that had sex differences as their primary focus, so they were mentioned in the title. Of these 31 studies, about 60% had fewer men and women than the Yale study. Some studies also subdivided their groups by, for example, clinical status. Nearly 80% of studies had fewer than 20 men and women in each of their groups of interest. Excluding the studies that were also interested in age effects, for which you'd reasonably expect a larger sample size, 86% of studies had a sample size at least as inadequate as the Yale study. Of course, it is not the intention of researchers to litter the neuroscientific literature with spurious findings of sex differences. But if it were their intention, this would be an extremely good way of going about it. The second difficult issue to be dealt with by neuroscientists is this. Even if the male brain were more compartmentalised and the female brain more interconnected, what difference, if any, would it make for how males and females think, feel, or behave? In the high-impact journal Science, Cambridge psychologist Simon Baron-Cohen and his colleagues suggested that the more compartmentalised style of the male brain may be better at understanding systems, such as legal systems, scientific systems, business systems, plumbing systems, because, to quote, "Systemising involves a narrow attentional focus to local information in order to understand each part of a system." They then suggest that the more interconnected style of the female brain may be better at empathising, because empathising involves integrating a lot of different kinds of information in a way that apparently understanding systems does not. In a similar way, neuroscientists Ruben and Raquel Gurr suggested in the book Why Aren't There More Women in Science that the male brain might be better suited to research disciplines that, to quote, require detailed scrutiny of narrowly characterised processes, such as physics and maths, while the female brain may be better for, to quote, disciplines that require integration. Unfortunately, this is completely the wrong way of thinking about the relationship between the brain and the mind. As philosopher of science Ian Gold has said, may as well say hairier body, so fuzzier thinker. Or that human beings are capable of fixing fuses because the brain uses electricity. If you consider what's involved in zooming in your attention on, say, a small aspect of the system of photosynthesis, is it really the case that only a little bit of the brain gets involved because only a local detail is being processed? Or is there activity all over the brain as distracting information is suppressed, the inner voice formulates ideas and poses questions, visual stimuli are processed, motion is imagined, and information is retrieved from memory? In truth, if it were suddenly decided that it was actually the male brain that is more interconnected, and believe me, there are such examples of these kinds of flip-flops in the neuroscientific history, neuroscientists can come up with no less plausible explanations for why actually it's this that makes them better at solving difficult problems in physics. The fact is, we are still at the very beginning of our journey of understanding how the neural circuits of the brain enable our mental processes. We just don't really know what it means psychologically for the amygdala to be a little bit on the large size, or for the anterior cingulate to activate a bit more in a particular task. And so, to quote neurobiologist Anne Fausto Sterling, despite the many recent insights of brain research, this organ remains a vast unknown, a perfect medium on which to project, even unwittingly, assumptions about gender. And when scientists project assumptions onto supposed sex differences in the brain, they license others to do the same, a task that popularisers take on with gusto, confidence, and enviable levels of imagination. Give them a concept like greater male lateralization, and they take it and they run. Popular child psychologist Steve Biddulph, for example, in his book Raising Boys, claims that greater male lateralization has enormous ramifications, such as for boys' mathematical skills, where being lopsided is good, and ability to talk about feelings, where being lopsided is bad. Any parent reading the book who also has a daughter will, of course, not have too much difficulty working out what this supposedly means for her. The prolific author Michael Gurian becomes impressively quantitative on the topic, explaining in an educational journal that the female corpus callosum, to quote, is up to 20% larger than in males, giving girls better crosstalk between the hemispheres of the brain. And that, to quote, because boys' brains have more cortical areas dedicated to spatial mechanical functioning, males use on average half the brain space that females use for verbal emotive functioning. Meanwhile, Alan and Barbara Pease, authors of Why Men Don't Listen and Women Can't Read Maps, take the lateralization hypothesis to its natural extreme by claiming that the female brain is so unspecialized for spatial processing that it doesn't even have a specific area of spatial ability, thus neatly furnishing an answer to the second part of the title of their book. In Leadership and the Sexes, we learn that female managers are more intuitive and less logical in their problem solving, thanks perhaps to the larger female corpus callosum. And in the ultimate neural justification of male inconsiderateness, John Gray of Mars and Venus fame and fortune informs us that the more compartmentalised male brain explains why he can never remember to buy milk. Clearly, scientists are not responsible for these ludicrous exaggerations and claims, but it is usually possible to identify the seeds of scientific speculation from which these monstrous fictions grow. The third issue for neuroscientists to deal with in their research is the malleability of both brains and minds. Our brains are the ever-changing product of a complex and dynamic interaction between brains, genes, hormones, and the environment and experiences we encounter. And sex differences in thinking, feeling, or behaviour are not fixed and eternal, but change across historical period, culture, socioeconomic status, and so on, and even in response to subtle changes in the social situation from moment to moment. What this means is that even if you find a reliable sex difference in the brain in a particular group at a particular time, and you link it convincingly to a difference in behaviour, which, by the way, has yet to be achieved, if you only take this one snapshot, you're left knowing nothing about how that difference came about, or what might reduce it, increase it, or make it disappear altogether. Yet in 2009 and 2010, how many functional neuroimaging studies went beyond a snapshot approach to investigate the effects of gendered experience, say, or demographic factors, or social cues on sex differences in the brain? None. So certainly, neuroscientists can and should criticise the many popular writers who mistakenly think that in the brain equals innate. But while a snapshot approach doesn't logically imply the idea of fixed and eternal differences between male and female brains, it also does nothing to challenge it or to illuminate other possibilities. If the research literature were full of studies investigating the malleability of neurological sex differences, would popular writers brandish the term hardwired around quite so freely? It's worth explicitly saying at this point that there is certainly excellent, thoughtful, and cautious work in this area. But the overall picture of the neuroscientific investigation of sex differences is, in my view, concerning. And while there's no time for me to go into it here, it's simply not possible to tear down the entire scientific patriarchy in just 45 minutes, although much more of this tearing down is available in my book. It is a similar story for research supposedly showing the effects of sex differences in fetal testosterone levels on gender stereotypical abilities and interests. So here again are poor methodologies, untested assumptions, mere lip service paid to the role of experience in development, and prematurely confident conclusions. What does it say about political values that we seem to care so little about getting it right in the science? And we can ask the same question about the readiness with which schools, businesses and spouses open their doors to anyone with a nice picture of a brain and a familiar gender stereotype. In what is a growing educational trend, both in Australia and overseas, boys and girls are being segregated in schools because of supposed hardwired sex differences in the brain. This small neuroimaging study of virtual maze navigation, for example, which had a participant pool of just 12 men and 12 women, fewer, in other words, than the Yale study, has taken on educational implications in the eyes of some self-anointed experts. These ideas are then picked up by a number of other self-anointed experts. Supposedly, the findings show that while boys find numbers intrinsically interesting, girls need to have maths put in context. Now, these neuroimaging findings from this particular study, even if it was actually anything to do with mathematics, which it wasn't, and even if they were reliable, which they almost certainly aren't, showed nothing of the sort. Neuroscientists would not even know where in the brain to look for intrinsic interest in numbers. But nonetheless, brain data like these are being translated into educational practice. As an age journalist described what's going on at a school near me in Melbourne, because of, to quote, natural differences in brain function between boys and girls, teaching boys maths was more about hands-on practice, drawing, doing the exercise. But in a class with girls, the middle school principal discusses the issues for a full 10 minutes at the start of a class, while the graph is put in the context of a relationship between two people. In other words, boys are getting on with maths, while girls are being amused with stories of romances between stolid Mr. X-axis and flighty Miss Y. And educators are listening. Last year, the headmaster of Eton College told a Sunday Times journalist that boys are, to quote, hardwired differently from girls, and that he would, quote, like to see ministers looking at the neuroscience and getting teachers to use it in state schools. In the business world, employers are being told to both appreciate and make allowances for the innate qualities of male and female brains. For example, this book targeted to business leaders states that, quote, when the male brain becomes angry, the swelling of the amygdala often leads to a near closure of a lot of the man's verbal circuits. Despite the fact that the swelling of a brain region generally calls for a neurosurgeon rather than the conflict resolution gender tools on offer in the book, the authors go on to suggest that this quirk of his amygdala implies that women, to quote, rethink their expectations of their male colleagues' behaviour during conflict. Don't, in other words, expect him to be able to calmly talk about it. And business leaders are listening. The gender science presented in this book, for example, has apparently been used by IBM, Nissan, PwC, Deloitte, and other major companies. And of course, let's not forget the important role of neuroscience in love and relationships. In the introduction to his book, What Could He Be Thinking? A question I asked myself many times of the author while reading it. Gurion describes the epiphany he shared with his wife Gail on seeing MRI and PET scans of male and female brains at work. To quote, I said, we thought we knew a lot about each other, but maybe we haven't known enough. Gail said, there really is such a thing as a male brain. It's hard to argue with an MRI. That's true, it is. We realised that our communication, our support of each other, and our understanding of our relationship were just beginning after 6 years of marriage. When Gurion describes the information from neuroscience as marriage-saving, I can't help but wonder whether it was the neurobiological evidence supposedly showing that the male brain isn't very well suited to seeing dust that really saved the day. And leaders of the third wave feminist movement are taking notes. In an opinion piece for the Sydney Morning Herald, Naomi Wolf used the word insights to describe Gurian's neurotosh, and described in entirely inappropriately respectful fashion Gurian's suggestion that women accept the biological differences that make men less capable of observing a pile of laundry. And women's brains? The neuropsychiatrist Luann Brizendine has drawn on neuroscience to set a new and demanding standard for emotional caretaking in women. She describes the female brain as, to quote, a high-performance emotion machine geared to tracking, moment by moment, the non-verbal signals of the innermost feelings of others. In fact, so skilled are women at this task that the female characters in the book know what their husbands are thinking before they even think it. Fact-checking, however, revealed that the idea of a female brain wired to empathise in a way that the male brain is not is based on somewhat shaky empirical grounds. A study of dead brains, for instance, where empathising abilities tend to be at baseline. A study that included only women, studies that did not test for sex differences, and personal communication with a neuroscientist that, when I contacted her, transpired to have never taken place. And readers are reading. This book was a New York Times bestseller, and I would just like to note that my book was not. I find the current situation concerning. It is not that I think that the neuroscientific investigation of sex differences is intrinsically problematic. My argument is not that it should not be done at all, or that it should not be open for discussion and debate. But suppose scientists were publishing unreliable reports of differences between black brains and white brains and speculating prematurely on their innate basis and psychological implications. Suppose media outlets were hyping up these reports and disseminating popular claims without even basic fact-checking. Suppose opinion writers were suggesting that inequality is therefore natural and inevitable. Suppose educational speakers were promoting racially segregated classrooms and corporate consultants were offering training packages promising to build on the different hardwired strengths of black and white employees. Would we be comfortable with that situation? This is the state of affairs we are currently in with regards to sex differences. And these scientific and pseudo-scientific ideas surely affect us. As A.J. Herschel put it, a theory about the stars never becomes a part of the being of the stars. A theory about man enters his consciousness, determines his self-understanding, and modifies his very existence. Our minds are exquisitely socially attuned and surprisingly sensitive to gender stereotypes. What social psychologists find is that when gender fades into the psychological background, men and women's behaviour becomes remarkably similar, even in areas where traditionally the sexes behave or perform differently. But when the environment makes gender salient, even very subtly, there's a ripple effect on the mind. Our thinking, our behaviour, the way we perceive others, and even the way we perceive our own selves, what we're good at, what we're interested in, becomes more consistent with gender stereotypes. There are many demonstrations of this, and I'm going to give you two examples. And the first is of that quintessential female skill, empathising, because it turns out that the ability to stalk the private feelings of others, like terrified prey, is surprisingly sensitive to social cues. The psychologist William Ickes and his colleagues have developed what is arguably the best measure of empathic accuracy, rather than just handing people a questionnaire that asks them whether they can tell whether people want to enter conversations, for example, where women outscore men. They actually test real behaviour and ability. It assesses people's ability to guess what an interaction partner was thinking and feeling during a natural, spontaneous social interaction. You might expect men to struggle with such a demanding task, but they don't. In the first 7 studies using this test, whether involved opposite-sex partners, heterosexual dating partners, newlyweds, or long-term spazzers, men performed just as well as women. But then suddenly, in the next 3 studies, the women started to do better. In trying to understand why this is, they noticed that there had been a slight change in the form that the participants had to fill out. The new form asked participants to say, after each judgment of what the person had been thinking or feeling, also how accurate they thought they were. When this form was used, womanly intuition existed, and when the old form was used, it didn't. The researchers suggest that this small change reminded women that they should be empathic and that this increased their motivation on the task. The social context can also affect men's motivations and abilities in this area. So if you tell young men that socially sensitive men are more likely to pick up women, their performance improves. Pay them $2 for every correct answer, or simply describe the test as one of more masculine-sounding complex information processing rather than social skills, and the gender gap disappears. So what about cultural stereotypes about what men are good at? A very large body of research now shows that the widely known belief that men are better at maths interferes with women's mathematical ability, a phenomenon generally known as stereotype threat. Blow the cloud of stereotype threat away, for example, by reassuring women that on this particular test no gender differences are found, or by making a social identity other than gender salient, and their mathematical ability, normally undermined, is unleashed. A recent meta-analysis concluded that they perform better than you would expect from their test or course grades, and they perform better than men with the same test or course grades. Even something as subtle as the suspicion that these kinds of beliefs enjoy a home in the minds of other people can influence our self-perception and behaviour. Confident claims about male brains hardwired to understand the world and female brains hardwired to understand people reinforce these stereotypes, bring them legitimacy. Suddenly we're no longer being old-fashioned and sexist, we're being modern and scientific. But interestingly and disturbingly, given how careless the treatment of the topic of sex differences in the brain often is, it may be the spontaneous assumption that differences between the sexes are hardwired that gives gender stereotypes a lot of their psychological potency. As a few studies have now found, if you tell women there's a gender gap in maths and it's because of nature, it's for genetic reasons, and you see the usual stereotype threat on performance. But tell women instead, yes, there is a gender gap in performance, but it's to do with nature, it's to do with your experience or your effort, and performance improves. What this suggests is it's not the mere belief that there are sex differences in ability that interferes with women's ability. It's the belief that those differences are due to hard wiring, that they're natural, inevitable, and immutable. And in fact, exactly this way of thinking about gender, essentialist thinking, has been linked with other self-fulfilling psychological consequences. Gender essentialists tend to see themselves in more gender stereotypic ways. They tend to engage less with behaviour that's more typical of the other sex, and they tend to accentuate gender differences. Gender essentialist thinking also helps people feel more relaxed about the status quo. So people shown scientific claims that males and females are hardwired to be different, compared with people told that these ideas are under scientific debate, express more confidence that society treats women fairly, and less confidence that the status quo was likely to change. And men were more supportive of sex discrimination in the workplace after reading such material. They agreed more with statements such as, if I would work in a company where my manager preferred hiring men to women, I would privately support him. And if I were a manager in a company myself, I would believe that more often than not, promoting men is a better investment in the future of the company than promoting women. As University of Melbourne psychologist Nick Haslam has summarised it, essentialism deepens social divides, making differences appear large, unbridgeable, inevitable, unchangeable, and ordained by nature. To me, this doesn't sound like very good news for sex equality. So what can we do? Earlier this year, I spoke at the Marxism conference in Melbourne, where my audience strongly and confidently recommended the downfall of capitalism as the only truly effective solution to sex inequality. At the Melbourne Business School, however, we're working on a more modest Plan B. Through the Centre for Ethical Leadership, with the support of 5 major industry partners, ANZ, Westpac, Coors Chambers Westgarth Law, Santos and New South Wales Police, we're starting to research how what you think about difference makes a difference in the workplace. How does it affect the way you behave, the way you perceive yourself and colleagues, the structure of your social networks? When it comes to the subtle unintended biases against women, especially mothers, that are often seen in organisational decision-making, are these increased in people who take a gender essentialist perspective? Does it make employees more vulnerable to stereotype threat, less likely to take up a traditionally male role? And if so, can we bring about positive, lasting effects by challenging the notion of hardwired sex differences in the brain? But we also have to consider the sources of these beliefs, including neuroscience itself. And I have to admit that I became quite despondent while I was writing the book. So as I mentioned, I began it in a spirit of optimism and naivety, and it took me a while to realise that I was basically writing a book that has been written many times before in the past and will have to be written again many times in the future. And I also realised that to critique sexist science is to chip away at only one small part of all that sustains sex inequality. But it is something, and science enjoys great authority in our society. And I hope that the scientific community will start to pay attention to what I see as a moral responsibility to stop making the same mistakes of the past. It is not my argument that there is no natural limit to sex equality. Perhaps there is. But currently, the science does not justify that door being slammed in our faces. Hypotheses about differences between male and female brains, and the kinds of things that they're good at and interested in, are built on spurious results, shoddy methodologies, untested assumptions, and premature conclusions, and a profound underappreciation of the deep reach of cultural patterns, beliefs, and expectations into our minds. Both science and society have advanced a great deal since the New York Times found space for the notion that the idiosyncrasies of the female spinal cord render women likely to be driven over the edge by the sheer heady excitement and responsibility of marking an X on a ballot form. We have come such a long way, but neurosexism is slowing us down. It's time to either start handling the topic of sex and brains with the care and the caution that it deserves, or to just put the brain down and step away. Thank you.
For those of you who've read some of the reviews of Cordelia's latest book, I'm sure what has been described in those reviews, which I'll read out, resonates very much with you. So words such as being delightful, powerful, clear and scholarly, takes no hostages, sparkles with wit, passion and scholarship, truly startling, forceful and funny, irreverent and important. I think we've all experienced that today. Cordelia, can I assure you that I've got a queue in my household for my daughter who's just finishing a Year 12 exams, who actually wants to be a neuroscientist, and my husband and son who are queuing up to read the book. We haven't had such a queue since Harry Potter came out, so maybe that's an indication that you could be on the way to maybe not get onto the bestseller there, but that's encouraging. It's been really great, given us a lot of food for thought. Very much thank you, appreciate that. We've got a small sign of our appreciation, which I will give to you. Thank you very, very much. And I guess speaking for the Department of Communities, we really value the work that we've done with Curtin University over the years for this lecture series, and we hope to continue it into the future. And my thanks very much to the staff across Curtin and my own Department of Community staff who's helped pull together today. Thank you very much.